All right, today's set of slides is about science and the scientific method. We're going to go through a couple examples, talk about the characteristics of science and of things that aren't science, pseudoscience. We may say a little bit about the value of science and some applications as well. I've got a word picture there talking about the words of science, and I have a Venn diagram showing science as the intersection of reason, experience, and observation. Last time, I talked about scientists. They are normal people, no matter what you might hear. And what's special about them is they're using the set of rules that allow them to evaluate ideas. And in science, these rules are really about evidence. Experiments are ways of evaluating an idea. They're a way of collecting evidence. And that helps us draw conclusions to evaluate whether an idea is correct or incorrect. This flow chart is a good example of how science works. In science, we're always trying to make decisions about ideas that are about the natural world. So that we base everything on observations, existing observations, and we try and explain those observations or manipulate the existing world. We develop ideas to do this. These ideas are, well, it may work like this or it may work like this. There may be multiple different ideas to explain how it works or how to solve a problem. The experiments then are a series of tests of those ideas where we evaluate the predictions of the hypotheses. And so gradually we eliminate hypotheses that are incorrect. And so if the evidence suggests they're incorrect, we eliminate them till we get to the best hypotheses. And that's the one that's had as many possible predictions come true and best explains the evidence that we get from experiments. Let's go through a specific example. Okay, we have lots of fossils of dinosaurs. These fossils are found all over the world, and they're of unusual animals, animals that resemble both birds and reptiles, but animals that aren't present in the world today. Why aren't they present in the world today? Why did the dinosaurs disappear? Well, we can think of several ideas that could explain this. Maybe it was competition from mammals. Maybe it was a disease that affected only dinosaurs. Or maybe it was something broader like climate change or volcanoes altering the Earth's atmosphere and surface or the impact of an asteroid. What really matters about these ideas is that we can think of a way to test them, to evaluate specific predictions. For example, the first idea, competition for mammals, that would suggest that we should see mammals increase at the same time dinosaurs are decreasing. Okay, and that's a specific prediction. How are we going to evaluate these hypotheses, though, in the case of fossils that are 60 million years old? We've got to find some evidence. We don't have a time machine. We can't run an experiment in the lab. But we can look for evidence that hasn't been collected yet. So we can go back into the area that we collected the dinosaur fossils and look at the layers of rock right around the time that the dinosaurs went extinct, both slightly before and slightly after, and at that exact time. And so we look for evidence and we see what we can find. In the case of the dinosaur extinction, we find that the evidence suggests that the extinction was extremely abrupt and that it affected many species besides the dinosaurs. Even mammal diversity decreased after this event. The diversity of marine creatures decreased. That kind of rules out the idea that mammals were out competing dinosaurs or that it was a single disease. Okay, and so we have to look at explanations that are larger, explanations like climate change, volcanoes, and a crater. And we do find some evidence for all of those things, But the most unusual evidence we find is that we find a large crater at that exact time, and that crater is in the Gulf of Mexico, just below the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. Okay, we also find widespread jumbled sediments that suggest there was a huge tidal wave originating from that crater. And worldwide, we find interesting, very unusual elements called shocked quartz and iridium at that point, which suggest a large asteroid vaporized a large volume of rock that was distributed by the atmosphere. Our conclusion is the best idea is the asteroid impact idea. So that's a really good example of how science works. Other types of science are slightly different. Sometimes science can be very descriptive, where we are describing observations, often using new instruments or new technology. That's a picture there of this Hubble Space Telescope and two photos of the same galaxy, one taken from the ground and one taken from the Hubble Space Telescope. And in this case, a new technology, we just start looking at things, and this leads us to new questions and new ideas, but it's really the technology that's leading us. It's the first look, and so we're documenting what we find and publishing it. So not all science is driven by hypotheses. Okay. In some cases, though, science is driven by hypotheses, and they can be very dramatic and have big impacts. Here's a picture of two guys, and I forget one of them. The guy on the left is Barry Marshall, and that's his partner, and they're receiving the Nobel Prize in Medicine. And they were challenging existing views of science about ulcers, peptic ulcers. These occur in the stomach, and these two men noticed that they were surrounded by quite a bit of inflammation, and when they did biopsies of these ulcers, that they sometimes would find bacteria. Okay, in fact, that's the bacteria there on the left. It's called Helicobacter pylori. And that went against the existing ideas about the causes of ulcers. They were thought to be caused by stress, by diet, by genetics, and ulcers were something you would have for your entire life. But they thought, well, maybe it's caused by bacteria because of the inflammation and the presence of bacteria. So they went looking for evidence. And the evidence they found was in biopsies. They biopsied many patients that had ulcers, and indeed, in many of them, they could isolate the bacteria, but not in all of them. And they knew, since ulcers have been recognized and treated for dozens of years, that they would need more evidence. And so they cultured the bacteria in the lab, and Marshall had an endoscope done of his stomach, and it was fine and healthy. So he took that tube of cultured bacteria and he drank it. And after he drank it, he noticed that almost within 24 hours, he developed some nausea, some stomach pain, bad breath, and other symptoms of an infection. And indeed, when he took another endoscope, they could see that, yes, he had lots of inflammation in his stomach and the beginnings of an ulcer. This was dramatic new evidence that he could give someone an ulcer by giving them a bacteria. And indeed, they were able to re-isolate the bacteria out of Marshall's stomach and able to cure him of this infection with antibiotics. This was really powerful evidence, and it changed the way that we treated ulcers. And it changed medicine in a way that affected millions and millions of patients, dramatic benefits, and an example where a scientific idea overturned accepted observations and accepted interpretations of data. All right, so that's science. There's a couple examples of how science works. Here's some pseudoscience, non-science kind of masquerading as science, or science that kind of goes off tracks. And this one's a very famous example, Linus Pauling and vitamin C. Linus Pauling was one of the greatest scientists of the last century. He was a biochemist that worked with proteins and protein structures, worked with quantum chemistry. He won 2 Nobel Prizes, and late in his life, he became convinced that vitamin C could cure or prevent colds and cancers. And he published a book, actually several books on it, and he became involved with mega doses, large doses of vitamin D, far beyond what people needed to prevent scurvy. And he presented some scientific work he had done with a small number of patients, cancer patients that were diagnosed with a terminal cancer, and he gave some of them vitamin C and showed that they survived longer. Almost immediately, there was some scientific pushback. Peer reviewers noted that he was inexperienced in working with human subjects. And so he didn't use the proper controls, a placebo and a double blind. And so some of the patients may have had their expectations affect how long they survived. And you can kind of imagine this in that some patients were enrolled in the study. They were told that the greatest scientist in the world, Linus Pauling, thought vitamin C could cure their cancer and that they were getting vitamin C. That's got to be a big boost. Other control patients were told Linus Pauling has a cure, but you're getting a control. And so the ones that got the vitamin C from Linus Pauling probably thought, well, I'm going to live longer, and they did. But when the studies were repeated with proper controls and repeated many times, they found that there was only a very small difference in any of these things. There was no difference among cancer survival, and for the prevention or duration of colds, only small differences in a small subset of patients. So when they tried to replicate his results, they really couldn't. Nevertheless, the myths about vitamin C have lived on. This is a good example of pseudoscience. I have a little table there that shows kind of some of the scientific data that other studies weren't able to replicate what Pauling did. And so this is a good example of what sometimes happens. Okay, another example of a pseudoscience is some of the science around vaccines. Some of and I shouldn't call it science, I should call it some of the commotion around vaccines. And it really deals with a disorder that's increasing, autism, where the cause was unknown. And a medical doctor, Andrew Wakefield, published a paper in The Lancet, one of the most important medical journals in the world, where he examined a small number of patients with autism and compared them with controls. And he came to the conclusion that there was a correlation between vaccination with the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine and the development of autism. Subsequent studies were unable to replicate this. They were much larger than Andrew Wakefield's original study. And over time, what happened is by re-examining Wakefield's original study, they began to look at this relatively small sample and how it was assembled. And it turned out some of the patients in the study were referred by lawyers who had a financial interest with some of the work Wakefield had done. And so there was a conflict of interest. They were trying to build a case against vaccine manufacturers so that they could sue them. Okay. What really made this a disastrous kind of event is that this received much publication in the press. Wakefield is still kind of pursuing this in the press and in movies and in internet things, but there's no scientific evidence behind it. It's a lot of conspiracy theories. Vaccines are really highly tested and monitored, and this has had really dire public consequences because it's reduced the number of people willing to vaccinate their children. And so now we're having outbreaks of measles, of rubella, of various other diseases that are completely preventable with vaccines. And so a good example of pseudoscience. All right, to summarize, science is a way of thinking. What's really important is that we develop high quality evidence about that helps us answer the question. And so science has rules to help us develop that evidence and think about it. Science can sometimes have really great applications and benefits, but it's limited in some respects. There are things we can't study with science, values, can't help us make ethical decisions, and often science, um, the benefits are more limited and the applications are more limited. Okay, so we'll stop there. Very good.